Let's get more on the summit and other news of the weekend. We're joined by the Australian's opinion page editor, Rebecca Wieser, and the Greens member of New South Wales Parliament, John Kaye. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Now, we'll obviously start with the G20 and what is going to be achieved, what Tony Abbott would like to have be achieved at the G20. Obviously, he's focusing on economics. Rebecca, how achievable is it that he'll come out with this Brisbane Accord and perhaps have his own way of he's looking at targeting economic growth, raising it by 2% over the next 5 years? Is that all achievable?
I think that's 100% achievable. Let's think about it. All of the leaders at the G20 want the G20 summit to be a success. Nobody's going in there to make it a failure. And as for achieving 2% economic growth on top of what's already done, is there anybody in the world who doesn't want to achieve more economic growth? So these are things that everybody will want to sign up to. Everybody will want to make it a success. So the commentary suggesting otherwise simply doesn't understand the nature of these sorts of summits.
But John, does that come at a cost?
Comes at an enormous cost. Abbott has said he doesn't want climate discussed at this. The world leaders are acting as if we live on an infinite planet with no constraints on it at all. There's been no discussion of labour standards that are going to be violated to get that 2%. I have grave concerns that this is yet another show pony for the European middle class, the American middle class, the Australian middle class, without any sense of what the consequences of those kind of growth rates can have on third world countries.
It's exactly the opposite. Economic growth has been most beneficial. We've seen more people lifted out of poverty in China and India, the creation of real middle classes in those countries that can push for even further change and social reform in those countries. And it's all come on the back of economic growth. The single most important thing to help these countries now is to get electricity. The people who are poorest and have the shortest lifespans are the people who are living without electricity, without clean water, and all of that is delivered through economic growth.
Rebecca, I really agree with you on electricity. Electricity is critical to health outcomes, to longevity outcomes. What I don't agree with you is, and I think you might have misunderstood me, is a target of 2%, which is delivered for domestic political reasons. Unless it's accompanied by a commitment to labour standards. You talk about the growth in the Chinese middle class, but you don't talk about the systematic violation of workers' rights in China. You don't talk about the systematic destruction of the environment in China. You don't talk about the growth in industrial-induced diseases in China. There needs to be, all I'm saying is there needs to be some balance. I'm not anti-growth. I just think growth at any cost, signatures on papers by world leaders that talk about growth but don't take into account the consequences and don't talk about smart growth, it comes at a terrible cost.
Yeah, but there's no point in saying that it's a choice between growth and not growing. It's a choice between how you grow. So in fact, a target of 2% growth is good. All you're saying is that you'd like to see other things being taken into account with the growth. You don't surely want 2% less growth.
Sure, there does seem to be some agreement between you both on that. No, I'd like to move on just slightly, though. I'd like to talk about...
good disagreement.
I'm slightly shifting the conversation about diplomacy, because this is at the core of what we're doing here, and a real belief that discussion can make a difference. And I'd like to ask you first, Rebecca, you're a former diplomat. How will these discussions... I'd like to... More importantly, are the discussions that are had in a formal environment more or less important than the ones that are done in these sort of private settings that might occur?
Well, the rule of international summitry, when is a summit most likely to achieve something really important? If the nations involved in that summit face a common threat, and if they have a common interest to try and come to an agreement. Now, for better or for worse at this time, that's not actually the situation. We have very different situation pertaining, say, in Europe, mired in terrible situation of no growth, the United States growing quite well, China having grown much faster but slowing down and so forth. So actually setting a target like focusing on growth is achievable. I don't think you can expect the big breakthroughs that you might have got, say, at the time of the oil shock in 1973. So there's always a limit. As for what goes on bilaterally, these things happen, of course, in a range of settings, including in settings like this, and they can be very important. I think probably the most significant thing for Australia to come out of this will be, apart from this agreement to overall growth, will be the free trade agreement with China.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. I mean, you talk about common threats. I mean, clearly, is there going to be consensus at this meeting when you have diverse opinions, and perhaps a common threat at the moment, aside from what's happening in the Middle East with Islamic State, you've got Ebola in Africa, is the Russian threat and thoughts of a new Cold War? Are you going to get consensus on global economic growth when you have perhaps that elephant in the room?
Well, obviously, Vladimir Putin and Russia see the emergence of Russia again, and it's pushing its weight in Europe in a completely different way to, say, the Europeans, Western countries, and so forth. So you're not going to get a common agreement about what that actually means. I think the Russia's emergence is very significant geostrategically, and that will impact in a whole range of areas. It impacts on energy and growth for Europe, for countries who import energy supplies from Russia. It's important in the Middle East because Russia plays a critical role in backing Bashar al-Assad, and so it goes on. What will happen in this summit? It's hard to see anything dramatic on that front.
John, what do you make of the flotilla of two? It seems. I mean, but
boys playing with their toys and posturing. I don't think it has any significant security implications for Australia.
But do you think that there is any concern from Vladimir Putin about the sort of the big talking, the ramping up of discussion and the stakes at this?
I think that works for him domestically.
And we've had more inflammatory language from him overnight, essentially, where he's sort of talked to Germany and the United States, saying they need to back off as far as sanctions is concerned.
But this is all for Russian domestic consumption. I mean, they love this stuff there. This is all about rebuilding national pride, and Vladimir Putin's an expert at manipulating the local media into rebuilding that pride. I don't think those boats or that language come with a real threat of physical conflict. They come with a real threat of deteriorating relationships, and they come with a real threat of internal dissent between countries backed by internal feelings of nationalism. And those nationalistic pride upwellings in Europe have a terrible resonance from history. One thing I did want to say, though, I want to really ask Rebecca, is that the tax agreements, the agreements on stopping tax avoidance, that's an area where there is agreement. There will be agreement. Is that right?
I think that what's interesting in the area of tax is that obviously it's of shared interest to try and crack down on loopholes. It's in nobody's interest, in no national government's interest, to be able to collect revenue, less revenue than it otherwise would. You do have to be very careful that what you come up with doesn't end up simply chasing investors out of countries altogether. What you want, because I think it was Joan Robinson once said, there's only one thing worse than being ripped off by a multinational, and that's not being ripped off by them. You don't want to chase the investment out altogether. Yeah. So whenever you make a regulation, you really have to study what are the unintended consequences.
All right, we are running out of time. I do want to touch on the free trade agreement with China, which is due to be signed, we believe, shortly. John, we've already heard, we haven't heard the finer detail, of course, but agriculture is seen as a bit of a winner, although there will be some losers, such as sugar, for instance. Do you have concerns that this may also come at a cost, perhaps as far as foreign investment, Chinese investment in Australia is concerned?
Well, look, there are massive risks with every free trade agreement. The US-Australia free trade agreement, the biggest free trade agreement we've ever been involved in, has driven up our costs of using copyrighted material, driven up our costs of medicine, with almost no economic gain to Australia. We don't know yet whether there will be investor-state dispute resolution provisions within this free trade agreement, which gives investors, private companies and Chinese government-owned companies the right to sue the Australian government for losses associated with our own regulation. There are real risks. There are risks to Australian manufacturers. There are risks also, I think, in terms of international labour standards. China has, as I said before, China has an appalling track record of not allowing free trade unions. Unionised workers in Australia will be competing more directly against Chinese workers who are not unionised, who don't have the right to collectively bargain, who operate under really atrocious occupational health and safety standards.
All right, that's all we've got time for today. But thank you very much for coming on the big G20 Day, John Kaye and Rebecca Weiser from The Australian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.